Hello, my students. I wanted to give you a little bit more information about poetry analysis. I know I said most of these things to you in our one-on-one meetings, and I said this in class, I know, but because we don't have a whole lot posted online for this, I figured I would just make this all into a video for you so that you can play it again if you need it. So the poetry analysis doesn't need to be on all the poems you memorized, just one of them. If you memorized one long poem, then you might choose just a section of it. But you can do a sonnet length in 3 pages is, you should have a hard time fitting everything you have to say about a sonnet into just 3 pages. And that goes for nearly any sonnet, whether it's a simple or complex one. So I'm going to work through this sonnet by John Donne, which I don't think any of you are working on, to show you how to go about this process. I am posting separate videos on the writing process, on how to do research, on how to use Zotero. So these might be more useful to your final research paper than it is to this poetry analysis, but do be sure to check out all those videos. These are things that you need to know, but I don't necessarily want to use up our precious classroom discussion time for. So, this poem by John Donne, I have already made notes on it. This is the first step in the writing process then, to brainstorm. So I have made my notes very neat because they were for an assignment many years ago where I went through each line in this poem and marked out the things that I noticed. You'll notice that I am citing the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, very frequently. So do use that dictionary. Do not use Merriam-Webster. Merriam-Webster is specifically an American dictionary, so actually not relevant, not as relevant as the Oxford English Dictionary is. It's more British. Also, it's going to give you the definitions through the ages rather than just the modern definition. John Donne was writing in the early to mid 1600s, and so a lot of these definitions don't hold anymore. So that's the first step to writing the poetry analysis, is just to analyze, just to look and to see everything that you see, to take your time to let it sit. The memorization will help with this, and as you see things, you'll want to notice things in terms of meaning, things that you notice in terms of sound and pattern. All this will be important to you. It doesn't matter if it seems important or not right now. Basically, just write it all down. And this footnoting that I've done here is basically that. I know this isn't terribly easy to see on a screen, but I'll just work through some of these. So John Donne says, "This is my play's last scene. Here heaven's appoint, my pilgrimage's last mile, and my race, idly yet quickly run, hath this last pace, my span's last inch, my minute's latest point." Right, this is the first stanza of, well, the first quatrain of a standard sonnet form, so that's something I will want to note, that we have 1, 2, 3 quatrains. The formatting on this last one is interesting. And then a couplet. "Impute me righteous, thus purged of evil, for thus I leave the world, the flesh, and devil." I should point out too that my assignment when I did this one was to use the original spelling. And so I not only in my notes have to talk about what these words now mean, but like what word this actually is. They used U's for V's back then. So evil, devil, leave. So I had to mark all that. So standard sonnet format. And if I mapped out the rhyme scheme, I would be able to see that too. This is partly why you want to mark it up on your page so that you can see any deviance, any differences in the pattern, and mark those. I will just work through this first quatrain, but you'll want to do this with all of them. So I have to ask this. To what does this refer? That's a pronoun. Pronouns replace nouns. What noun is it replacing? This is my play's last scene. And so my note on that is, well, it refers most obviously to his time in life, and that's in the context of the whole sonnet. I can see that. But he could also be referring to the sonnet itself, which is kind of interesting. So I'm just going to mark that for now. That is probably referring a little bit to both, but most obviously to this time in his life. And then these are things I did not note down at the bottom because they're part of a summary. This is my play's last scene. So he's comparing through this one. He makes several comparisons, and he says that this time in his life is like the last scene in a play. It's like the last mile in a pilgrimage, and it's like the last pace in a race. All right, so those were 3 metaphors, and it took him 3 lines to say each of those. But then the last line speeds up, and we get more metaphors in a shorter space. It is his span's last inch. So span, I had to look this one up in the Oxford English Dictionary. Span is the distance from the tip of the thumb to the small finger. It's about 9 inches. We don't use that term anymore. So I had to, so basically it's a measurement. It's the span's last inch. It's his minute's latest point. So we had 3 metaphors in 3 lines, and then we have 2 metaphors in 1 line. So you can see that it's kind of speeding up. Also, what's interesting is we started with a play, and then we had a pilgrimage, and then we had a race. So each one of these is kind of increasing in intensity and stress, but they're all, a play is a time, a play is a piece of art, pilgrimage is a journey, a race is also kind of a journey, but it's a much shorter and much faster one. So there's a progression happening here. But then we switch to actual points of measurement. So a span is a way of measuring space, and a minute is a way of measuring time. So we're progressing not just from art in terms of stress to race, but we're progressing from measurement of distance to measurement of time. Also, the measurements are getting smaller. A span, this distance is pretty small, but it's also doesn't feel as small as a minute, right? And then point, that this whole section should end in just 1 point. It's as though all of his life is being condensed into this 1 point, all right? Also, however, it doesn't pause at the end. The end punctuation here is not a period, it's a comma. And so it goes into the next line, so it's kind of spilled over. So even though I said I was just going to talk about the first quatrain, it's really hard to do that, which is interesting. So this is my play's last scene. Here, heavens appoint, so God has appointed that my pilgrimage should have its last mile, and my race, which I ran not very well, but I ran quickly, has this last pace, this last measurement. It's just a passage or a root, also from the Oxford English Dictionary. And then, gluttonous death will instantly anoint my body and my soul, and I shall sleep a space. So my comment on sleeping a space is that it is a metaphor for death. Very abruptly, that is, he will die. It's a metaphor. Sleep is often a metaphor used for death in the Bible. John Donne was a very religious person. He was Catholic, and then he became Protestant, and he became the Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, I think in London. And so he's famous for the sermons that he wrote too. So it makes sense that he would use a biblical metaphor for death. And then I listed all the references, which is very intense of me. I don't expect that of you. All right. So that tells us that this is a poem about the moment before death. So he has reached that time in his life that is right before death, which he did write this right before he died. He died slowly of an illness. And so he's writing this on his deathbed. And I'll speed up a little bit. So what's happening is that he is trying to come to terms with his death and what is going to happen to him after that. So this first sentence, this is all one sentence, there's our first period right there at the end, is just describing where he is and what's going to happen. So I'm at the end. Everything has come to this one point, and death is going to anoint my body and soul that is dedicated to itself. So I am going to die, or presently, I know not, I shall see that face, whose fear already shakes me every joint. And it's a little bit ambiguous what that face was. I looked up a scholar to see what they might say about this. And it turns out that this wasn't the original reading of this line. My ever awakening part shall see that face. So there's some ambiguity there. This could be a doubt that the poet resolved before the revised version. So we don't really know what's happening there. It's okay, by the way, if there's things that you don't understand in your poetry analysis. The more you study your poem, the more there will be that you don't quite get. That is fine. That is the way poetry works a little bit. So what you want to do is find the thing that you can say. And here is one thing that we can say. He is very afraid of dying. I don't know if it is the face of death or perhaps of God that is causing the fear that shakes him in every joint. But this is what he sees happening. So in this stanza, we start to see him self-splitting. And it could be that this ambiguity here is pointing towards that self-splitting. And so as my soul to heaven takes flight, so my soul will go to heaven, but my earthborn body, because it's born of earth, it will dwell in the earth. So, you know, the way you're laid in the ground in a grave, right? And yet my sins, because everything has to have their due, everything has to have the right, will go to where they came from, and that is hell, right? So he's divided into three: soul to heaven, body to earth, sins to hell. But here's the fear. His sins will go to where they are from, but they would also press me, all of me. So it's his sins, the things he's done wrong in his life, that great division is splitting him, but trying to drag all of him down to hell. And that's his fear. Not just that he will be divided, but that he will not see heaven. And so that is sort of the height of this fear. Notice how this stanza ends with hell. It's all come to this point, and he is wondering, he is afraid, not of death, but of hell. And so that's why we have this huge shift in tone at the end, where it's unclear before this who he's talking to. He's sort of just thinking, this is my play's last scene. Here, heaven's a point, my pilgrimage's last mile, my span's last inch, my minute's latest point. Here I am, here we are. But I'm afraid I am going to hell. And then the voice changes, impute me righteous. Okay, so this is vocative, right? This is a command. It's the way you say, shut the door, turn on the lights, right? Impute me righteous, okay? Now, because this is one of his holy sonnets, we know from the context of the other sonnets that they are all written in as prayers. So this is addressed then to God. impute me righteous, thus purged of evil, for thus I leave the world, the flesh, and the devil. And this is a very clever undoing of the division that happened in this last stanza, because remember, his body goes to earth, his soul goes to heaven, his sins go to hell, but the world that he lives in altogether, he'll leave that, but he'll also leave the flesh that is buried in the earth, and he will leave the devil that would drag his soul to hell, right? So if God imputes him righteous, then he will have only the soul left to fly to heaven, which is where his soul belongs, right? Now, I would also need to look up impute me righteous, because if you come from a Christian background, you might feel like you know what that means, but even if you do think you know what that means, look it up, because these definitions change over time too. And the way that he's using it here is a little bit interesting. So impute literally means to set to the credit of, to ascribe, or to reckon as. So he says, count me, credit me righteous. Consider me righteous, to ascribe to a person by vicarious substitution. So this is all very heavily implying Christ's vicarious atonement for sin on the cross. Impute that to me. Take that into account. And he's also drawing from Romans 4, attribute righteousness to me. Impute me righteous. And I also am noting the change in tone. So that's what this means. He's begging that Christ's righteousness be counted as his own. Okay. So that gives me an overall claim about what this poem is about. I can say that he is trying to come to terms with his death, and with the fear, specifically the fear that his soul, that he is going to be divided between heaven, earth, and hell. And so it turns into a prayer that he not be divided. And the only way for him not to be divided is to be imputed righteous. So take that long statement, boil that down, and I've got a thesis statement. Okay, so briefly then, the requirements for the poetry analysis, and I have the beginning of it here. I don't have a complete one for you to look at, partly because I really just want to see how y'all do this, and it's pretty straightforward, honestly. This then would be a kind of thesis. In this sonnet, the poet seeks to understand his own death. Now that I've done a little bit more thinking on it, I would say to understand his own death, the division, and he prays for unity in the end, through unity, through righteousness, through the imputation. Okay. So that's the big idea of this sonnet. And now my job is to see how, working through the 3 quatrains in the couplet, he affects that meaning. How does he make that meaning happen? Okay, and that's why what you see here is divided into 3 sections. It's taking a lot of what I just said and just writing it out. He begins by understanding his death by various metaphors. They come to this point. So this is interesting because they do come to this point. But if my overall claim now is that he's coming to understand his division, things seem to have condensed into this point and then they divide out from there. So that's interesting. We've got this point and then we've got this separation, which then sort of that contraction and expansion. that difference, that dichotomy causes the fear, right? So we are meant to feel the same fear that he felt, and he uses his poetry to do that for us. And so these would be topic sentences just as I'm working carefully through, and I won't post this document, but I'll leave this here. You can pause and look at this just to see how you might work through this piece. And then what I would do from here, so this is my outline, and what I would do from here is just expand it with the notes that I have down at the bottom of this poem, so that I can draw in the Oxford English Dictionary definitions of the particular words and show how the poetry is working. So you'll notice that I'm not making a huge effort to use poetic terms. You don't have to. You do want to look through the poetic terms so that you can see what sorts of things what can a poet do with a poem? And things like coming to a point, and then expanding the things that he does here, the world, the flesh, and the devil, how he's reversing the division that happens in the previous quatrain. Those are poetic things that he's doing with the syntax and with the content and meaning, so that the way the poem is structured and sets up imitates the meaning of the poem. And in this case, not in every case, but in this case, enhances the stress, and so increases the energy of the prayer at the end. So it's actually exaggerating the feeling that you get in just the straight up meaning of this poem in a really intense and beautiful way. The way that these metaphors start slow and then sort of speed up and get more urgent, that's all poetic stuff that you can talk about without necessarily using all the big words. It'll be hard to remember the big words once you leave here. It's more important just to see that these things can happen in a poem. And I would like to see that played out in your poem. So 3 pages, double spaced. This is a draft, which is why it's not in that format yet. You need an introduction. That you don't need a ton of background information in your introduction, but if you find that it's useful, you can add that. For instance, it would be useful to this one to know that Donne was the Dean of Christ Church Cathedral, so we can trust that his references are to the Bible. It's also helpful to know that this is one of the holy sonnets, so we know that they are mostly addressed as prayers. So feel free to bring things in from the other poems that you've memorized or that you've looked at in that introduction. And then focus on the poem itself, work through it chronologically. It'll be easier that way. And I am mainly looking for good content and an easy read. I will have another video that I will post with the rubric and an explanation of the rubric, so you can see how I go about grading these. I think that is all you need to know. I will be giving you an extra few days on this assignment just because I had technical difficulties and my video broke the other day. I got it working this morning and I have posted as soon as I can. So I'll give you a few extra days to make up for technical difficulties. And so if you have any questions, we can talk about them in class tomorrow. So Aurora Lee, I will see you then. Good work, y'all. And yeah, see you tomorrow.